There are these two areas when we discuss speech comprehension and production. There's the vernix area and the Broca's area, right? The vernix area is located in the temporal lobe, which is here, right, on the left hemisphere. So this is where your vernix area will be somewhere here, right? This area is responsible for speech comprehension, either written or spoken. So right now, if somebody did a fMRI on you or put EEG, those nodes on you, right? Your vernix area would be getting stimulated because you're listening to me. So you're comprehending information, right? Your Broca's area will be absolutely quiet because you're not producing information. Whereas your vernix area will be very active at this point because that's the part that is receiving all of this information that I'm giving to you, right? Just 1 second, getting call. Right. So vernix area is very important from that point of view that it allows for comprehension and even written or spoken comprehension, right? Very important. Um, Sometimes there is damage that takes place in the left temporal lobe and it might affect the vernix area. So you'll see a lot of people with damages on that part where they're not being able to understand what is going on or what someone is saying to them. So then they're taught sign language and all. Even people with sign language, it's still vernix area that is being activated. So it's like a language center, very important, right? Then you have Broca's area, which is again left present on the left hemisphere, but it's there in the frontal lobe, so somewhere here, right? It's closer to the motor cortex. This is responsible for facial muscle movement as well as speech production. So what for me right now, vernix area is not as active as my Broca's area is, right? My Broca's area is more active than my vernix area. So if you want to remember this, just think of Broca as Bhasker. Bhaskar is teaching you. Bhaskar is teaching by producing language and speech. Therefore, Broca's area is related to speech production. Vernix area is the opposite, which is speech comprehension, right? Now, this is generally the trend for males. For females, the right hemisphere is also involved in language production and comprehension, right? Therefore, sometimes you'll hear, right? People will say that, oh, she's picked up language faster than him when they have like two children, male, female, or they have twins. They'll say that the female child has picked up language faster. The reason is that both hemispheres are being used. The other thing is that even when there is damage to the left hand side of the brain of the hemispheres for the female, they're still somehow able to generate language with practice, whereas that's really difficult for males. So there is that difference in terms of hemispherical difference that is there, right? Now, damage to either of these two parts, that is the vernix area or the Broca's area, can cause either agnosia or aphasia, right? Agnosia is the inability to recognize familiar objects. So things like your pen, pencil, laptop, bottle, gas stove, anything, right, that you use regularly. Uh, the inability to recognize that is agnosia because recognition requires labeling, right? And labeling requires language. Language is absent. Therefore, recognition gets affected, right? So that's agnosia. Aphasia, on the other hand, is the inability to comprehend and formulate language due to damage to specific brain regions. So again, comprehend, formulate language is Broca's area, vernix area. So that's aphasia. When somebody cannot produce language or they can't comprehend language, when there is damage to either the Broca's area or the vernix area, then you will say that that person is having aphasia, right? Uh, when they can comprehend language, they can speak, but they cannot recognize what XYZ products are, then you will say that that person has agnosia, right? So that difference you have to understand. Uh, so what the way I remember this usually is that aphasia has Asia in it, right? Asia is a word that I can comprehend and pronounce properly. Therefore, if I have aphasia, meaning I am not being able to pronounce Asia, right? Or I'm not being able to comprehend the word Asia, what it means. So therefore, aphasia means that inability to comprehend or formulate language. That's how I remember it. Now you can create whatever trick works for you. That will be the best thing, right? Agnosia, again, I remember it saying that agnosia, nose, right? So inability to recognize my nose is it's just a what is that? Mnemonic for me sort of thing to understand what agnosia is. That's how I remember it. If you try and mug this up, you'll forget. If you try and just like just remember, it will not come back to you. But if you have these techniques, you'll be better prepared, right? Uh, Then there are other issues like this, the inability to do certain things, right? So you have uh, prosopagnosia, which is the inability to recognize familiar faces. So it's a type of agnosia, right? It's there in the word itself. If you notice, it says prosopagnosia, right? Agnosia is there. That's the inability to recognize familiar faces. It's caused by the issue to the fusiform gyrus, right? There's a place called fusiform gyrus, which is around fusiform gyrus is the whole thing, and then there's a face area in that called the fusiform face area. Damage to that causes prosopagnosia, which is the inability to recognize familiar faces. So people with Alzheimer's also have this issue with them, right? Because obviously there is a neurodegenerative disorder, so the brain is sort of dying out, and therefore fusiform gyrus at some point gets damaged, and therefore they also suffer from prosopagnosia, right? The inability to recognize familiar faces. Then you have phonagnosia, which is the inability to recognize and identify familiar voices, right? So again, it's agnosia in both of them. Prosopag meaning vision, phono meaning auditory, right? That's one of the ways to remember it. Then you have pure alexia, which is the inability to recognize words visually. So if you say something, they'll remember, but if you show it to them, they will not know what that word is, right? So the way I remember pure Alexia is to think of Alexa, right? Alexa obviously doesn't require words to be there visually, but then that's just a cue for me to understand, okay, it's about words, visual words, right? So these are five important things that usually come in net. Agnosia, aphasia, prosopagnosia are the regular ones. Alexia also is there sometimes. Usually this is given to you in a match the following sort of scenario, right? In which case, if you're lucky, if you know a couple of them, then the rest you just have to fit into the match the following, right? So if you know two, you're more or less set, but don't risk it. Remember all five. Um, Again, I'll tell you how I remember it. Agnosia it reminds me of nose reminds me of people. So it's the inability to recognize familiar objects. Aphasia reminds me of Asia. Asia is a word I can comprehend and speak clearly. So the inability is that. Prosopagnosia is a long word, so I just remember it for some reason. Is the inability to recognize familiar faces. People with prosopagnosia sometimes they can't recognize their own face also, right? In a very extreme form. Now this is linked with fusiform gyrus. The reason I think I remember prosopagnosia very well is because I've written a paper on emotional recognition. So that I think over time, when you keep typing and you read articles, it just gets stuck. Phonagnosia is the inability to recognize familiar voices. Again, phono meaning or audio, agnosia meaning inability of recognition of familiar things. And pure alexia is the inability to recognize words visually, right? So if you had pure alexia, you would not be able to read this PPT. I think that's a very easy way to remember it, right? This PPT that you see, you wouldn't be able to read anything on it if you had pure alexia. Um, Now we come to brain lateralization. This is basically the localization of functions in each hemisphere of your brain, right? Not brain, basically the cerebrum. Um, so the two parts, right? The two fissures of the brain, big fissures of the brain, are linked by this bundle of neurons known as the corpus callosum. So they're really thick and tightly knit, and all the information passes from either side to either side, right? The left hemisphere is responsible for speech production and comprehension because, again, Broca's area, Wernicke's area. It's also linked with math and arithmetic ability. It's also linked with logic and positive emotions, right? So this entire left hemisphere is linked with these things. And the right portions of the body are controlled by the left hemisphere because, again, if you remember, medulla is the place where the nerves cross, right? So all the information from the right side is coming from the right side. It's going up till here from the right side. And then as soon as it goes to the medulla, it shifts direction and goes to the left side of the brain, right? Similarly, from the left side, all the information goes to the medulla and goes to the right hemisphere. The right hemisphere is linked with spatial relations, facial recognition, and negative emotions, right? Um, Now, there is more research available that says that these hemispherical differences are not as clear cut as we used to think they were, right? Actually, both sides of the brain are not equally, but both sides of the brain can do each other's work basically, right? So this is sort of debunked now. However, we don't know the like people who are creating that exam. you don't know whether they have this information or not, right? So to be on the safe side, just remember these things, right? And if there is an option that says that there is both sides can do both things, then tick that. If that option is not there, then you tick on whichever side works for you, right? Um, Now, again, there is also information that people who are left-handed have better right hemispheres and people who are right-handed have better left hemispheres. That's also sort of debunked now. But again, if that is the question and that option is not available, then you answer it accordingly, right? Uh, and we discuss split brain. When you say split brain, basically the corpus callosum is damaged, right? It's not cut out, but it's damaged, which means it's not being able to do its function properly. That is passing information between each of the hemispheres and coordinating your behavior, right? So it's not being able to do that because it's damaged. The main person who studied this was a guy called Roger Sperry. So remember this. Um, Now, what happens in an event where the corpus callosum is destroyed is that both hemispheres start to do their work. They're both doing their work. They both think they're doing the right thing. But because there is no communication taking place between them, they might hamper each other's work, right? So sometimes you'll see with people with split brain, if they want water, what's happening is that the entire body and everything else is telling them get water, right? And they might move both their water at different speeds and different positions, right? Because what has happened is the communication between the two hemispheres has not taken place about which hand will move, right? So the preferred hand will usually go and grab the bottle in the right way, but the other hand also might move because the motor cortex is passing information saying move your limb to get the water, right? Now, because there's no coordination going on, it will look really ridiculous, right? Same thing with walking, running, these things will not be possible. So a lot of the basic coordination that is required starts to get hampered, right? Um, However, over time, if the damage is not very severe, the brain sort of adapts. That's the beauty of the brain, right? It has the ability to be plastic. Plasticity is a very important concept of the brain, right? So over time, it will learn. It will learn that this problem exists, and it will start to evolve accordingly and try and manage uh, this damage that is there. And sometimes there is new neurons also that start to connect, right? So this is a process that is known as brain plasticity. It's also known as neuronal plasticity because anywhere else apart from the brain where this regeneration of neurons or the ability of neurons to interconnect with each other, right, and form new connections takes place. Apart from the brain, that's where it's called neuronal plasticity. In the brain, it's called brain plasticity, which is basically the ability of the neuron to change in structure and function, right? So that's a very important thing. Whenever you learn a new skill, basically what's happening inside your brain is that a few neurons are there, they're connected to other neurons, right? And as you get better, the connections start to increase. Myelination also increases, the connections start to increase and they start to link with other parts of your brain and so on. You start to get better, right? Basically, in a very rough sense. So this is a very important component. The issue is that as you get older, the amount of plasticity will start to drop, right? You won't have enough material to continually engage in this. However, existing neurons can still connect with other neurons, right? Creation of neurons might become slightly less in terms of the rate, not the numbers, but the rate of new things. So that's why you will hear people saying, right, difficult to learn a new language when you're older compared to when you're younger. That's because, again, plasticity, the amount that is required is slightly lesser, right? The process of production of new neurons in the nervous system is known as neurogenesis. And then this process takes place through the stem cells, right? Stem cells, the neural stem cells will help in the creation of new neurons. So these are present in the brain and they are uncommitted. So they're just there as bank, basically. Think of them as money in your bank. They are just there. Whenever you need it, they are available and they can mature into a neuron and then fit into wherever the neuronal connection might have died out. So for example, suppose you learned how to play badminton, right? When you were a kid, you learned how to play badminton and you played every day for 6 months. So you got really good at it. Then whatever you lost interest and you stopped playing, right? So what's happening in your brain in the motor cortex is that the skill for badminton has started to improve, right? More neurons are getting connected and they're trying to coordinate between each other about, okay, this hand moves, this hand should be here, and technique and all of these things it starts to take into account and it gets better and better and better, right? And then you stop playing, so what starts to happen is these connections are no longer functioning in the same way. So the brain will slowly start to, these neurons will slowly start to die out, right? Because they're not being used. They slowly start to die out. And suppose like another 6 months pass and you're like, hey, I want to play again. So when you go and try and play badminton, you won't be as good. But over the course of a week or 2, 3 days, you'll suddenly start to come back to the same level. What's happened? The same area, new connections will be formed, right? And then again, if you keep practicing, those connections get better and better and better, better, right? Those new connections that are formed by new neurons that are created by the stem cells, right? Again, very important question that NET usually asks about stem cells.